What if the man in the mirror looks grown, but inside he is still living as a boy? Imagine a suit and tie wrapped around a nervous teenager. Bills are paid, muscles trained, careers attempted, yet the nervous system trembles at responsibility, the way a child trembles at the dark. We have a cultural nickname for this, Peter Pan syndrome, but beneath the cartoon image of a boy who never grows up lies something heavier, more human, and far less amusing. Many men carry a hidden wound into adulthood. Sometimes it begins with an absent father, not only physically gone, but emotionally unreachable, silent, or dismissive. Other times it begins with an overprotective mother who, out of love and fear, shields the child so much that he never learns to stand on his own trembling legs. These parental imprints freeze the natural process of individuation, the slow carving out of a solid self that can carry weight. When that individuation is interrupted, the boy becomes a man in body only. Inside, the psyche still waits for permission to grow. The truth about immaturity is rarely spoken. We often hear that it's laziness, a refusal to man up, or some moral failure. But immaturity is not an absence of years, nor a lack of intellect. It is a defense system, a nervous system frozen in survival mode. The man avoids responsibility, not because he does not care, but because responsibility feels like unbearable exposure. To carry weight, to choose, to risk. For him, it echoes danger, abandonment, punishment. Psychologist Carl Jung used the term puer aeternus, the eternal boy, to describe this archetype, not as an insult, but as a symbol, the part of the psyche that refuses to leave the safety of adolescence. The pure is charming, creative, eternally young, but also terrified of grounding, terrified of limits, terrified of becoming fully accountable. Dr. Gabor Mate, speaking from his work on trauma, might add that what looks like irresponsibility is often a wound in disguise. Addiction to immaturity, like addiction to substances, is a way to soothe unbearable feelings that once had no safe outlet. So here is the provocation. What if your immaturity is not laziness at all, but a survival strategy you never retired? What if the boyishness you hide or defend is not weakness, but an old shield, one that once kept you alive, but now keeps you stuck? To see immaturity this way does not excuse the damage it causes, but it opens the door to compassion. The man who flees from love, sabotages work, or avoids fatherhood is not merely selfish. He is carrying a nervous system trained to believe that stepping into responsibility equals stepping into danger. And unless that nervous system learns safety, the pattern repeats. This is where our exploration begins. Over the next chapters, we will enter the different faces of immaturity: dependency disguised as freedom, dopamine loops, the father wound, projections in love, the terror of responsibility, and finally, the collective culture that mirrors all of it back to us. Each section will hold a mirror, name a truth, and offer a micro-practice, not as a miracle cure, but as a small ritual of choice. Because the journey from boyhood to manhood is not about killing the boy inside. It is about integrating him. Maturity is not the loss of youth, but the ability to carry both the playful child and the grounded adult in one body, the boy's spark and the man's spine. So let me leave you with a question to hold as we begin. When you look at your own life, where do you notice the mask of adulthood covering the fear of a boy? And if you dared to set that mask down for a moment, what part of you would be revealed? Emotional dependency, disguised as freedom. There is a particular irony that repeats itself in the lives of many men. On the surface, they appear free. No commitments, no strings attached, no one telling them where to be. They might drift from relationship to relationship, change jobs every year, or carry themselves with a certain swagger that says, "I answer to no one." Yet if we look closer, what we often find beneath this apparent freedom is not liberation, but a hidden dependency that has never been resolved. The silent wound here is fear of abandonment. A boy who once felt unseen or left behind often grows into a man who cannot risk depending on anyone, because depending means the possibility of being left again. To soothe this fear, he builds a mask of independence. But behind that mask lives a compulsive hunger for validation. He may need constant reassurance from partners, approval from peers, or the admiration of strangers. He needs others to reflect back his worth, but he cannot admit the need, so he disguises it as freedom. Attachment theory names this pattern well. Anxious attachment mixed with avoidance. Jung's archetype of the pure eternus adds another layer. The eternal boy avoids grounding in commitment because commitment feels like captivity. Yet, paradoxically, he is already captive, enslaved not by a partner or a job, but by his own childhood fear. The very thing he avoids becomes the prison he cannot escape. Think of the man who refuses long-term relationships because he claims he is too free for chains. He may tell himself he wants to live lightly, yet deep inside, every time a partner asks for deeper commitment, the body remembers the terror of abandonment. Rather than face that terror, he runs. In running, he believes he is free, but the truth is harsher. He is not running toward freedom, but away from fear. That is not choice, it is reaction. Here lies a useful experiment. Begin to notice the difference between a true choice and a reaction to fear. A true choice feels grounded. I want this because it aligns with who I am. A reaction feels urgent, slippery, almost compulsive. I can't stay here. I need to leave. I must prove something. The question is not, am I free? The question is, am I choosing or am I avoiding? To ground this, imagine a simple 3-step test. First, pause and name the decision you are making. Second, ask yourself what fear would happen if you made the opposite choice. Third, notice whether your body relaxes or tightens as you imagine that scenario. If your body tightens and you feel the pull to run, you may be in the grip of avoidance, not freedom. We see this confession written over and over in anonymous corners of the internet. Men admitting that they sabotage relationships, not because they truly want solitude, but because intimacy feels unbearable. Some even say, I thought I was too free for chains, but really, I was just too afraid to stay. This is the raw honesty many carry in silence. There is no shame in this pattern, though it often breeds shame. It is not weakness to long for connection while fearing it at the same time. It is not hypocrisy to crave validation while pretending to be above it. It is simply the nervous system remembering abandonment and doing whatever it can to protect itself. The work begins not in forcing commitment, but in recognizing the disguise. Freedom that is born from fear is not freedom at all. It is dependency and camouflage. The paradox is this: to truly become free, one must dare to acknowledge the need that has always been there. The need to be seen, to be chosen, to belong. Naming the wound is not losing independence. It is the first taste of genuine sovereignty. When you look at your own patterns, ask yourself this: which of my so-called freedoms are actually reactions to fear? And what might genuine freedom look like if it were rooted not in avoidance, but in grounded choice? Dopamine loops. Why pleasure keeps you a boy. There is a hunger inside many men that does not quiet down. It is not only sexual, not only about money, not only about winning. It is the endless craving for the next hit of pleasure. Pornography, video games, casual hookups, endless scrolling, the quick thrill of a purchase or a drink. These things are not random distractions. They form loops, like grooves in the brain, designed to keep a man circling the same ground without ever moving deeper. The hidden mechanism here is neurological. Dopamine, the chemical that fuels anticipation and reward, is released in sharp spikes when we chase novelty and instant gratification. But dopamine is not satisfaction. It is the spark that makes us chase satisfaction. The system was designed for survival, to reward us for finding food, for exploring, for mating. But in modern life, the system has been hijacked. With endless stimulation at our fingertips, the brain learns to seek only the quick hit, never the slow nourishment. Compare this to serotonin, which carries a different kind of signal. Serotonin is steadier. It rises when we feel connection, when we engage in meaning, when we contribute to something larger than ourselves. But serotonin does not spike in the same way. It requires patience, presence, and repetition. A culture that rewards dopamine loops pulls men away from the long road of meaning into the short circuit of pleasure. Here lies the inversion. Chasing pleasure is not evidence of hedonism, but of anesthesia. Many men are not indulging because life is too sweet. They are numbing because life feels too empty. The boy who could not tolerate pain grows into a man who cannot tolerate silence. And so he fills the silence with stimulation, hoping the noise will drown the ache. There is a reason why stories of collapse often follow this pattern. Think of the Wolf of Wall Street, a man at the center of every possible pleasure loop: drugs, sex, money, status. On the outside, it looked like abundance. On the inside, it was a spiral into collapse. The story is not extraordinary. It is simply the exaggerated mirror of what happens quietly in millions of lives every day. If we ask why this happens, part of the answer is psychological. The immature man resists suffering because he associates it with failure, shame, or punishment. So he avoids the slow road of meaning, which requires discipline, disappointment, and patience, and instead grabs for the quick fix. But here is the cruel paradox. The avoidance of pain creates more suffering. Each loop leaves him emptier, needing the next hit even faster, and terrified of facing the silence where meaning might be born. There is no need to moralize here. Every nervous system, when wounded, will try to soothe itself. Some soothe with food, some with validation, some with screens. The act itself is not the deepest issue. The issue is whether a man becomes trapped in the loop, unable to imagine a life outside it. A small experiment can begin to open the door. Replace one dopamine loop with a ritual of delayed gratification. Not all of them, not forever, not with pressure, just one. For example, before watching a video or taking that drink, step into a cold shower. Not as punishment, but as a reminder that the body can tolerate discomfort. By pairing the discomfort with the reward, the nervous system begins to relearn that pain and pleasure can coexist, that not every ache must be numbed. Over time, these small substitutions build a bridge back to serotonin, to the deeper satisfaction that grows in the soil of patience, presence, and meaning. It is less dramatic, less thrilling, but infinitely more nourishing. The question then is not, how do I quit pleasure? The question is, what pain am I refusing to face that keeps me chasing the loop? Because when the silence is no longer unbearable, the loop begins to break on its own. So pause for a moment with this thought. If you look at your habits honestly, which pleasures in your life are truly nourishing you, and which are simply numbing you? And if you were to let one loop go quiet, what silence might rise in its place? The father wound. Why discipline feels like punishment? For many men, the word discipline carries a bitter taste. It does not feel like freedom or growth. It feels like control, punishment, or humiliation. The very idea of rules, boundaries, or consistency sparks rebellion. Yet beneath that rebellion lives a deeper wound, the absence, distortion, or collapse of the father figure. A boy learns structure not only from being told what to do, but from watching how authority holds itself. If the father is absent, physically gone or emotionally unavailable, the boy grows up without a living example of steady authority. If the father is harsh, controlling, or abusive, discipline becomes linked with shame and fear. In both cases, the boy carries an unresolved relationship with authority into adulthood. He does not know how to hold himself with structure because his nervous system either never saw it or only saw its shadow side. Jung wrote about the father archetype as a symbolic force. The father represents order, direction, and the power to ground a man into his path. Without that archetype, the psyche feels unanchored, pulled in many directions at once. The immature man may believe he is rejecting the father, refusing to conform, refusing to obey. But in truth, he is still bound to the father, not by presence, but by absence. The rebellion itself shows the tie has never been resolved. Nietzsche once said, "He who cannot obey himself will be commanded." Discipline, in this light, is not about submission to an external authority. It is about self-creation. To establish rules for oneself is not to punish, but to forge a spine. Yet for the man with a father wound, even this act feels unbearable. The voice of authority is still the echo of a father who was too harsh or too absent. This is why so many men only discover the value of structure after collapse. It might be addiction that finally breaks them, divorce that shatters their illusions, or a health crisis that forces a new rhythm. At rock bottom, the absence of structure can no longer be denied. Out of the ruins, they begin to build what was missing all along. But must collapse always be the teacher? Not necessarily. A different path begins with reframing discipline itself. Imagine it not as a cage, but as a ritual. To define one rule for yourself, small, clear and non-negotiable. For example, a bedtime you actually honor, a daily walk you do not skip, or a financial boundary you refuse to cross. Enforce it not with shame, but with reverence. Treat it as sacred, not as punishment. This practice is not about the rule itself, but about what the rule symbolizes, the restoration of the father archetype inside your own psyche. By setting a line and holding it, you step into the role of the father you needed, firm, consistent, and committed to your growth. A man who enforces one self-chosen rule begins to taste something new. Not the bitter taste of control, but the quiet strength of trust in himself. Each time he honors his own line, the nervous system learns, structure is not punishment, structure is protection. So the question arises, in your life today, what is one boundary you could treat as sacred, not to restrict yourself, but to restore the father inside you? And if you were to hold that line, how might your relationship with discipline begin to change? Immaturity in relationships, the trap of projection. Love, for the immature man, often begins with fire. It feels like destiny, like recognition, like finding the missing piece he has been waiting for. Yet, over time, the fire burns not into warmth but into chaos, cycles of intensity, withdrawal, drama, and collapse. The man is left confused, wondering why his love stories so often turn to ashes. The hidden truth is that much of what he calls love is not relationship at all, but projection. Jung described projection as the act of placing an inner image onto another person. In men, this often takes the form of the anima, the unconscious feminine within the psyche. When a man has not integrated his anima, he seeks her outside of himself, in the body and presence of a woman. But instead of seeing her as she is, he sees his own unhealed mother wound reflected back at him. He does not find a partner, he finds a mirror. This is why so many men unconsciously seek partners who resemble their first experience of love, often the mother. If the mother was nurturing but overprotective, he may seek women who smother him. If she was absent or unpredictable, he may feel drawn to women who are inconsistent, unavailable, or chaotic. The chemistry feels electric because it is familiar, but familiar does not mean safe. It means the nervous system is reenacting childhood, hoping to resolve it this time. From the outside, this looks like a soulmate connection, the sense of knowing someone instantly, of being swept up in passion. But what feels like destiny may be trauma in disguise. The nervous system confuses intensity with intimacy. The heart believes it has found love, but the body is trapped in repetition. This pattern shows up everywhere in culture. Think of the fascination with toxic couples in shows like Euphoria. Their fights, their reconciliations, their volatility. Viewers are drawn in because it mirrors a craving many secretly carry. It is not just entertainment. It is recognition of an inner drama. The obsession with chaos is a symptom of a deeper hunger for what was missing in childhood. How then can one begin to tell the difference between projection and authentic bond? The first sign is pace. Projection rushes, demands, burns fast. Authentic bond grows slowly, with steadiness and clarity. The second sign is emotional rhythm. Projection feels like highs and lows, addictive cycles of craving and withdrawal. Authentic bond feels like calm presence, even when it is not dramatic. The third sign is autonomy. In projection, the man feels incomplete without her, desperate for her to fill a void. In authentic bond, he brings his wholeness and meets hers. Recognizing this difference is not about blaming women or condemning desire. It is about honesty. The immature man in love is not evil. He is haunted. He is searching for the mother he lost, the chaos he knew, the validation he craves. The path to maturity begins with seeing this clearly, without shame, without denial. Love is meant to be a meeting, not a reenactment. The anima, when integrated, becomes a source of creativity, intuition, and balance inside the man. When she is not integrated, she becomes a projection that keeps him trapped in cycles of heartbreak. So here is the invitation to reflect. When you look back on your relationships, how many of them were true encounters with the other person? And how many were reenactments of an old story you never finished? And if you could step out of projection, what would love look like when it is no longer a repetition of childhood, but the creation of something new? Power avoidance. When responsibility looks like death, there is a quiet terror that lives inside the immature man. the terror of responsibility. On the surface, it may look like laziness, procrastination, or lack of ambition. But beneath those behaviors lies something deeper. To take on responsibility means to risk failure, and failure echoes old wounds. For some men, responsibility feels less like an opportunity and more like stepping toward death. This fear is not irrational if we trace it back. A boy who carried the shame of failing a parent's expectations, or who was punished for small mistakes, learns to associate responsibility with humiliation. Later, as an adult, even simple commitments, a project at work, a relationship, fatherhood, carry the same weight. The nervous system whispers, if I try and fail, I will be exposed, abandoned, crushed. So he avoids. The avoidance brings temporary relief, but it breeds anxiety, guilt, and a constant sense of unfinished adulthood. Philosophers have long wrestled with this tension. Schopenhauer described life as the struggle of the will against suffering, the will to live, to strive, always colliding with the reality of pain. Viktor Frankl, from the experience of the concentration camps, spoke of responsibility as the path to meaning itself. For Frankl, freedom was not the absence of responsibility, but the embrace of it. A man becomes himself not by avoiding weight, but by shouldering it with purpose. This is the paradox. The immature man believes that avoiding responsibility will keep him safe. In truth, it keeps him anxious. The more he avoids, the heavier responsibility becomes in his imagination. The longer he delays, the more monstrous it appears. Immaturity is not comfort. It is the constant tension of knowing that life is waiting and that he has not yet entered it. But responsibility does not have to arrive all at once. Imagine it instead as a microdose. One choice, owned fully, with no excuses. It could be as small as taking responsibility for one conversation, one bill, one boundary, one honest admission. The size does not matter. What matters is that the man feels himself carry the weight and survive. Each small act teaches the nervous system that responsibility is not death, but life. Naval Ravikant once said, "Freedom is responsibility." This inversion strikes hard against the cultural myth that freedom means escape. Escape from rules, from commitments, from burdens. In reality, escape is just another form of captivity. True freedom comes when a man can say, I choose this weight, I will carry it, and in carrying it, I find my strength. Many men only taste this after collapse, when they are forced into responsibility by circumstance. But it need not be forced. It can begin quietly, deliberately, with one act per day that says, this is mine to hold. So the reflection is this. What responsibility have you been avoiding because it feels too heavy, too final, too terrifying? And what would happen if just once you chose to carry one small piece of that weight? Not because you had to, but because freedom itself depends on it. The archetype of the eternal boy. Collective immaturity as culture. Up to this point, we have looked at immaturity as something personal. Wounds from childhood, patterns of avoidance, projections in love. But there is another layer, one that reaches beyond the individual. The boy who refuses to grow up is not only a private figure, he is also a cultural archetype. Our society itself has learned to reward immaturity, to celebrate the refusal of responsibility, to glorify the endless adolescence of consumption and distraction. Look around, and the signs are everywhere. Consumerism tells us we never have to grow up, that we can buy our way into youth forever. Entertainment trains our nervous systems to crave constant novelty, endless escape, infinite distraction. Even rebellion, once a symbol of growth, has been repackaged into something superficial, performed without depth. The culture mirrors back the same avoidance that lives inside the immature man. Do not grow, do not suffer, do not commit, only consume. Jung's archetype of the puer aeternus captures this perfectly. The eternal boy is not just a psychological figure, he becomes a societal spell. A spell that whispers, stay young, stay free, stay untethered. But spells always have a cost. A culture that refuses to grow up risks collapsing under its own weight, just as an individual does. History gives us sobering mirrors. Rome, before its fall, became decadent, obsessed with entertainment, bread, and spectacle. The people were distracted, softened, unprepared for the weight of responsibility. When the collapse came, it was not sudden. It was the natural end of a long adolescence. This is not to say we live in the same conditions, but the warning stands. A society that idolizes immaturity will eventually pay the price. What makes this collective spell so powerful is that it feels normal. If everyone is binging, scrolling, escaping, then to resist feels strange, even isolating. To step out of the loop is to feel for a moment like an outsider in one's own culture. Yet that is precisely what individuation demands: the courage to step out of collective hypnosis in order to reclaim one's own spine. One way to taste this shift is through a cultural fast. Choose one thread of cultural infantilization, whether it is social media, binge entertainment, or fast dopamine stimulation, and set it aside for a week, not as punishment, not as moral purity, but as experiment. Notice how your nervous system responds. At first, there will be restlessness, even panic. But beneath that panic, something else stirs. The slow reawakening of presence. The eternal boy archetype is not evil. He carries gifts, creativity, playfulness, spontaneity. But when he rules unchecked, both the man and the culture remain suspended in adolescence. The challenge is integration. To let the boy's spark survive inside the man while still grounding in the spine of adulthood. To bring play and responsibility together rather than allowing one to devour the other. So consider this. In what ways has the culture around you been training you to remain a boy? And if you were to step out of that spell, even for a short while, what kind of man or what kind of society might begin to emerge? From boyhood to manhood, crossing the threshold. In traditional cultures, there was always a moment when a boy was invited to cross a threshold. An initiation ritual, often dangerous, often symbolic, marked the passage into manhood. The community recognized it. After this, you are no longer a child. You carry weight, you belong among adults, you bear responsibility. In our modern world, most men never experience such a threshold. The body grows, the years pass, but the psyche waits endlessly for a moment that never arrives. This absence leaves many men suspended. They carry the mask of adulthood, jobs, bills, appearances. But inside, the boy remains uninitiated. He longs for someone to call him across, yet no one comes. And so he drifts, half man, half child, waiting for permission that never arrives. But maturity is not the killing of the boy. It is the integration of him. To grow does not mean to abandon play, creativity, or spontaneity. It means to place them within a frame strong enough to carry life's weight. The boy's spark belongs inside the man's spine. The man who integrates both carries humor and depth, lightness and gravity, tenderness and strength. Immaturity, when seen with compassion, is not weakness, but an old survival strategy. The child learned to protect himself with avoidance, pleasure, rebellion, or projection. Those strategies worked once. They kept him alive. But what protects the child can imprison the man. Maturity begins when we recognize the shield for what it is. Not evil, not shameful, simply outdated. Imagine a soldier walking into battle still carrying his childhood toy. At first, it looks charming, even humanizing. But when the arrows begin to fly, the toy cannot protect him. What once brought comfort now becomes a liability. Many men live exactly this way, carrying the toys of childhood into the battles of adulthood. The work of individuation is not to despise the toy, but to decide whether it belongs in the hand or in the memory. The journey from boyhood to manhood is not linear, nor is it ever complete. Every man carries the eternal boy within him, and the task is not to erase him, but to bring him home. To create a psyche where the boy can play and the man can lead. To live a life where freedom is rooted in responsibility, love is freed from projection, and discipline becomes sacred rather than punitive. So let me leave you with this question. What toy are you still carrying into battle? And if you were to set it down, or place it gently on the shelf of memory, what space might open in your hands for the tools of a man? If this reflection has given you clarity, take a moment to notice which part of today's journey resonated most deeply. And if you wish to continue exploring these thresholds with me, you are welcome to subscribe and stay close. The path of integration is long, but no man has to walk it entirely alone.